Now that we have learned about the 6 characteristics of life, the idea is this. Once you classify something as being living, you then have to turn around and you have to classify it. So at this point, while you're watching the video, you'll want to make sure that you fill in the classification notes because we're going to go through some terminology and then we're going to talk about how you can classify organisms. So here's a picture of Linnaeus, that's how you pronounce it. Linnaeus is famous for coming up with the first classification system, and that classification system is called binomial nomenclature, which we'll talk about later, but that's what Linnaeus looked like. Before Linnaeus, they didn't really have a special way to classify stuff. It was just kind of put into odd random groups. So this right here is sort of the classification system he came up with. Again, we'll talk about the binomial nomenclature more on the next slide, but taxonomy itself is simply just the study or the naming of organisms. So we can call it the science of naming and classifying organisms. So I'll repeat that. Again, it's the science of naming and classifying organisms. And based on Linnaeus's system, you have to go through sort of this hierarchy. So you have to start with the kingdom, and once you decide what kingdom it's in, then you have to decide the phylum, and you just keep on going down the chain until you get to the genus and the species. Now, in this case, the species is really just the second part of that name, and that's where the binomial nomenclature comes in. So here we have a chart. It's labeled binomial nomenclature, and I'll explain where that actually is. Binomial nomenclature just means a two-part naming system. So bi meaning two, and nomenclature meaning name. So two-part naming system. And the binomial nomenclature is really down here at the bottom of the chart. And what that means is, in order to name an organism, you use the genus and you use the species. The genus is just a description of the group of organisms. So this is Latin or Greek for something. It's a description of the group. And then the species is really just an adjective describing a specific organism from that group. So again, the species is really just an adjective to describe a specific member from the group. And then, of course, that larger group that has something in common is the genus. So for example, and I have a place for that, let's write out the following. We have Quercus, alba. And by the way, I'm going to underline that because if you are writing a scientific name, you want to make sure that you just capitalize the first letter and then lowercase everything else and then underline or italicize. So that's Quercus, Quercus, alba. We'll write out another scientific name or another binomial nomenclature, and that is Quercus rubra. And then we'll write out one more. Sorry, I'm kind of running out of space here. And we'll do that Tito alba. So you'll notice here these three organisms have some similarities. These two right here have the same genus, the Quercus, and this one here and this one here have the same species, which is description of the genus. Now the question might be which two are most closely related. And in order to determine that, you have to look at the genus name, not the species, because Quercus actually means maple, and alba means white, and rubra means red. So this one up here is the white maple, this one is the red maple, and this, Tito, means owl. So this is a white owl. Obviously not as related to the Quercus alba as the rubra or the Quercus rubra would be. Okay, so make sure you look at the genus when you're trying to determine how closely related two different organisms are. So in the rest of your notes, what we're looking at are the 7 levels of Linnaeus's classification system. I just realized I didn't have that on my next slide. But Linnaeus's classification system, which we saw earlier, it was the second slide, goes kingdom, then phyla, then class, order, family, genus, and species. So before you can even get to the species, you have to start at the kingdom, decide the phyla, then the class, and the order, and you keep on going through. So for example, humans. We are in kingdom Animalia. We are phyla Chordata because we have a backbone. We're class Mammalia because we have hair and mammary glands. We're order Primates because we fit under that group. We're family Hominids, and actually, if you look at the classification today, there's nothing else in that family, but we're still in that family. We are genus Homo, and we're species Sapien. So that's how you would go through the classification system. However, of course, we're constantly changing things, and so in your notes there's something that says modern classification. Now, before kingdom, we have added a category, and that category is called a domain. And these are the 3 domains. We have domain bacteria. Domain bacteria, you can see here on the slide, is our true bacteria. It is prokaryotic and it's unicellular. It's typical everyday bacteria. Because of what we know now about the bacteria that's out there, we've actually taken bacteria and we divided it up. And so there's another domain called domain archaea. And domain archaea is bacteria that live in extreme environments. So we call them extremophiles. They are still prokaryotic. They are still unicellular, but they live in extreme environments. So not something you would run into in your typical everyday walk around a school or at home, but you would see domain bacteria in that category. Archaeas are divided into these different groups based on where they live. So for example, something called a thermophile are bacteria that live in extreme heat, so they like it hot, they like lava, that sort of thing. We have something called acidophiles. Acidophiles like low pH, very acidic conditions. We have something called halophiles. Halophiles are bacteria that like extremely salty conditions, so they might like living, for example, in the Dead Sea. We have something called methanogens. Got its name from methane gas. So they like to live in the guts of organisms like cows that produce a lot of methane gas. They also like swampy areas, places where a lot of other organisms can't live, but that's where they like to live. So these are extreme bacteria, which are different from your typical everyday bacteria, but they are both prokaryotic and they're both unicellular. The third domain is domain eukarya, which is where we fit into. These are protists, fungi, plants, animals. We'll talk more about them on the next slide, but they are the organisms that have a nucleus. And so pretty much anything that has a nucleus gets thrown into that domain. And then once we decide what domain it's in, then we can go through kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. So this is sort of a new addition to the classification system. And so the last thing that you're going to do in your notes is talk a little bit about the 5 kingdoms. So once we have decided what domain something's under, we then have to decide the kingdom. First of all, there are no kingdoms under domain archaea. So no kingdoms. Only because they're relatively new, and so there really haven't been kingdoms classified for them. But domain bacteria does have a kingdom, and that domain bacteria just abbreviate that, has what's called kingdom Monera under that. Again, it's just your typical bacteria, and you can just kind of go from there into phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. But these other four right here, these other four kingdoms, there's 5 kingdoms total, are all found under domain Eukarya. And there are specific characteristics for each of these kingdoms that you'll be filling in on your chart. Okay, so obviously your kingdom Monera, which is under domain bacteria, is going to be prokaryotic. It's going to be unicellular. They have cell walls made of something called peptidoglycan, kind of a weird sugar that makes up the cell wall of bacteria. And their nutrition, they're heterotrophs and autotrophs. Bacteria get their energy different methods depending on the strain of bacteria. But these 4 kingdoms right here that are all eukaryotic, so you can fill that in on your chart. So kingdom fungi, kingdom animalia, kingdom plantae, kingdom protista are very unique. So for example, let's do kingdom protista. This kingdom was developed simply because they weren't plants, they weren't animal, they weren't fungi. So if they weren't those 3, but they had a nucleus, they threw them in a kingdom together. So this is where algae fits in. Believe it or not, algae is not a plant. So algae is a protist. We have paramecium, these tiny unicellular things. We have amoebas. You may have heard of the brain-eating amoeba that had been going around a couple years ago. They're protists, but the idea is this. Some have cell walls, some don't. Some are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. So protists are extremely diverse. Their cell walls can be made up of anything if they have cell walls. So it's not until we get to plants, animal, and fungi where we really start to get some defined characteristics. So for kingdom fungi, you may think, oh, mushrooms, they're all multicellular. Nope, they're not. By the way, protists can be multicellular or unicellular, if I didn't say that. Very diverse. There's one example of a unicellular fungus, and that is yeast. So fungi can actually be unicellular. However, most of them are multicellular. They do have cell walls. It's made up of a special sugar called chitin. We'll talk more about that in another unit. And they are heterotrophs because they decompose. They do not make their own food. With plants and animals, they are the only 2 kingdoms that are only multicellular, except animals are heterotrophs and plants are autotrophs. And since plants have cell walls, we have to look at what their cell walls are made up of, and they're made up of a special sugar called cellulose, which we will talk more about later on. So that information right there should allow you to be able to fill in that kingdom chart. So what I would like you to do then for the rest of the notes is look at the 3 questions that are related to classification and see if you can fill them in.